Hi, my name's Chad Bishop, and I'm an organizer with the Missoula Central Labor Council and Good Jobs Missoula. We're here today with Ben Henry. He's an author of the Job Gap Report, and he's also working with Montana Organizing Project. This is Micah Nielsen. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell them what you do?
Sure. My name is Micah Nielsen. I'm the program director for Montana Women Vote, and I'm really excited to talk about the Job Gap Report today because it's definitely something that impacts low-income women and families disproportionately compared to other parts of the population.
Go ahead.
My name is Emily Likins. I'm an organizer with the Missoula Workers Council, and I'm a maitre d' at Vegan Pizza. I'm really excited to talk about the families out of balance because the living wage really affects my day-to-day life. And we're finding ways with the Workers Council, retail, service, kitchen workers coming together to find solutions to the problems that we're seeing.
Well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Ben, would you like to take a few minutes and sort of just break this out for us and tell us what the Job Gap Report's about and how it relates to Missoula and workers here?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Ben Henry. I'm the Senior Policy Associate with the Alliance for a Just Society, and we work very closely with the Montana Organizing Project here in town. And as we have this discussion, I really want to pose this question to viewers for you guys to think about as we have this discussion. Are you able to make ends meet? Or do you know someone who's not able to make ends meet? Who's struggling to meet basic needs? And I would say, if you do know someone, go easy on them because maybe it's not as much their fault as you might think it is. There's a lot of systems at play here that I think we forget the impact of that on our lives. And so we're going to get a lot into that here today. We've all been hearing a lot about the minimum wage. We've been hearing about Medicaid expansion, about funding our schools. And the question we need to get at is why are we having these discussions? Why do we need to take these steps for a better, more prosperous Montana? So at the Alliance, we put out a study. It's called our Job Gap Economic Prosperity Series. And last month we put out a living wage study. And what we basically are trying to do is calculate in real, tangible ways what does it take to make ends meet. We talk a lot about the minimum wage, but according to our findings, the minimum wage falls far short of actually meeting basic needs. So statewide in Montana, it costs, if you're a single individual, it costs, or you need to earn $14.40 an hour just to meet basic needs. And this is transportation costs, housing, food, childcare, just very basic costs, not extravagant needs. And we use data sets that are pretty credible from like government level. And so these aren't numbers that we're just pulling out of thin air. These are just very simple calculations that we're making. And we're finding that for our families here, the numbers just aren't adding up. If you're a single mom with 2 kids, you need to earn $25.82 an hour to meet basic needs, which might sound like a lot to folks out there, and it is. There's also this notion that, okay, well, you're not making the wages you need, just go get a job, just go find a better situation. But those living wage jobs just aren't out there. So last year we did a report that found for every living wage job, if you're a single individual, every living wage job, there are 8 job seekers out there looking for that same job. So there's 8 times more job seekers than there are living wage jobs to be had. If you look at, for a single mom with 2 kids, for every living wage job, there are 32 job seekers, 32 times more job seekers than there are living wage jobs. And so it's kind of getting at this value that a full-time job, and our numbers assume you work 40 hours a week, which then we can have a discussion about that. That's a whole other story. 40-hour a week jobs are pretty rare as well. But jobs should pay enough to cover your expenses. It's a basic American value, and what our data is showing and what we're seeing in Montana and across the country is that increasingly that is becoming this impossible ideal that is just not able to be attained. And meanwhile, workers, regular folks like us, are, we're working hard, keeping our head down, doing the right things, but just not getting anywhere. And really, we got to do something about that. And it's up to us. It's up to the workers to feel empowered to be able to do that. It's this value that hard work should be rewarded. And our data is showing us that it is not being rewarded. And a lot of that is due to policies that just aren't supporting the families the way that they need to be, like the minimum wage. It's very exciting. We're looking at the prospect of an $8 minimum wage here come January. I think it's the fact that our minimum wage is tied to inflation, so we see a slight increase every year. That's a wonderful thing, but we shouldn't be hanging up mission accomplished signs just yet. It's still, even at $8, falls far short of meeting basic needs. $8 is a little more than half of a living wage for a single adult. And it's about a third of the living wage for a single parent with 2 kids. So we have a long way to go. It's a great modest step, but a long way to go. In DC, we're having a debate about increasing the federal minimum wage, which hasn't increased in 5 years, to $10.10 an hour. And it seems like this huge figure. Are we ready to make quite that much of a leap in increasing the minimum wage? But when you put it in the context of what it actually takes to make ends meet, even $10.10 falls far short. In Seattle, the city just passed a $15 minimum wage. It's not going to be $15 for quite yet, but there's a schedule that gets us to $15. $15 seems like this astronomical figure, but again, even at $15, it falls short of meeting basic needs. So the question is, and maybe I'll pose this question to the panel here, is what happens if you don't make a living wage? What are the compromises you have to make? What are the impossible choices? What are those kitchen table conversations like when you're falling short of actually earning enough to make basic ends meet? And one more issue is debt. Our numbers don't take into account debt payments, and so that's a whole other issue, and we'll get into that in a minute. But for now, I would like to just kind of pose that question: what are some of the compromises and difficult, impossible choices that you've had to make?
Well, I know that in Missoula, there's really a culture of scrappiness and independence, and people find ways to make it work. It's actually kind of rare to find people in Missoula who have cars, because cars are expensive. A lot of people don't do things like buy new clothes. They have clothing swaps. We see this as this poverty becomes more pervasive throughout our community. We see people coming together to still try to make ends meet one way or another. But that struggle in and of itself is draining and exhausting. Being always on the edge of poverty, always wondering if you're going to have enough to make that rent check, is a really exhausting and unhappy existence to have. So while we see people still being resilient in the face of this poverty, it's just not really fair to have to live our lives that way. So it's a really complex issue. But we see people giving up leisure time in order to take on another job. We see people giving up vacations, visits home to see their family. We see people foregoing things like social events, participating in the community. These are all things that lower our overall quality of life. And there's a lot of ways that we can fix it if we go at it from all the right angles. But right now it's a frustrating existence to lead.
I think there's two things specifically that I would talk about. Low-income families in particular having to give up, especially when debt is factored in. And the first of those things is safety nets. If you work a low-income job and happen to be injured somewhere else, usually you aren't compensated for the time that you're not able to work. And if there is an opportunity for you to have a savings account, which many people who work a minimum wage job, aren't able to pay a ton into their savings, it can make or break a family's financial stability. And not only is that an issue with someone just making or not making rent, but it can be the difference between a family being homeless or not. And the rate of homelessness, especially in Missoula, is pretty high, especially with families with kids. There's quite a few kids with parents who work low-income jobs that are technically homeless. And like Emily said, we're a community that does come together, and we support each other in those times. But when the difference between supporting each other is whether or not a family is able to stay in their home, and whether or not breaking your back can mean the difference between you being able to, provide for your family or not, those are the kind of decisions that families have to face every day. The second thing that I would talk about is nutrition. We talk a lot in this country about healthy kids and making sure that our kids have the opportunities that every other kid has, especially when it comes to school lunches and things like that. But when a family has to make a decision between $10 for vegetables and fruit and a balanced meal, let alone paying for half of each plate being made of fruits and vegetables, or being able to feed everyone equally with, $10 in top ramen, the choice is pretty simple, especially when that means the difference between paying their rent or not, or paying a heating bill or not. When you factor in debt into those things, it makes those decisions even tighter. And there are some safety net programs that are available, but they're not available for everyone. For example, if you have student loan debt but make a certain amount per year that is, above minimum wage, chances are you're not able to get food stamps. So you're still making that decision between, I have $10 to spend at the grocery store today. Do I buy, 20 meals worth of something, or do I buy fruits and vegetables?
And Micah can speak to this a little bit more, I'm sure, but when you look at things like the failure to expand Medicaid and Medicare and the cuts to Medicaid, we're looking at folks in our community really not being able to afford to see the doctor. Even with these social safety nets, whether it's a low-income family or, a grandparent who's retired, when you start seeing these deep cuts to these programs, you see people not only not being able to afford nutritious food, so they're eating food that's making them sick, but then not being able to go to the doctor once they're sick. And then probably turning around and making your meal in the kitchen because they don't have paid time off to stay home and nurse their cold. So we see a whole slew of issues, from public health to the very personal individual right to take care of yourself when you're sick, to these policy decisions.
I'm glad you brought up Medicaid expansion, because there are 70,000 people currently in Montana that fall in that gap that would be, cared for if we actually expanded Medicaid in this state. What that means primarily is that if someone does get sick to the point of needing to go to the doctor, because, going in for your regular checkup is not an option for a lot of low-income families, that can, again, make or break someone's ability to survive that month. Not only that, but the rate of uncompensated care drastically increases, which makes everyone's rates increase. So when you talk about the economic impacts of not providing services for low-income folks, it affects all of us. It's not just low-income people that we're talking about. It's all of our rates. It's all of our ability to, go and make sure that we can see the doctor when we need to. But especially when you're talking about, there's a lot of low-income families where their children are on CHIP, so essentially children's Medicaid, but their parents are not able to access the same kind of health care. And I firmly believe that you should not have to make the decision between going to see a doctor and not going to see a doctor based upon whether or not you can afford healthcare. In that sense, healthcare is a human right because it not only affects you as an individual, but it can also affect the health of your kids. It can also affect the health of your community. And it also, has a really large economic impact for our state. So, when you talk about Medicaid expansion, the benefits to individuals and individual families can be the difference between life and death for a lot of folks. And our inability to expand Medicaid probably has meant the difference between life and death for a lot of people by receiving care that they need to when they need to. But, when you think about the far-reaching impacts of providing people with a living wage, that's certainly one that comes to mind.
Can I jump in real quick and add something? One thing that we've been seeing for the last year, we spent a lot of time speaking with people working, low-wage jobs, and we ask a really simple question: what is your dream? What are your goals beyond this? And we're seeing that they have to put off all sorts of things that they want to do in their life because they cannot get out of this cycle of poverty that they're working in. These are smart people with college degrees. These are people that could run the restaurants they work in. They could run the retail shops that they work in. But they spend a lot of time, working 2 and 3 jobs, and getting that car, like you're saying, that's a dream. That's not even a tangible reality. Or taking that vacation to see a parent or a friend that they haven't seen. So these things are heartbreaking every time you talk to them, to hear that these are dreams. These aren't tangible things that are going to happen soon.
And we're having this conversation about the compromises you have to make when you don't make a living wage. And it's important to take a step back and see really what systems are in play that they're putting us in this position. There's this whole notion of personal responsibility, but when you're drowning, it's how did you get there? Who put you there? What put you there? What an interesting paradox it is that for someone who doesn't have a lot of resources, if they want to get food, the compromise they have to make is they have to buy cheap, unhealthy food. We as a society, our policymakers, decide where we put our resources, our collective resources, and they've decided to put it in subsidies to big giant farmers and corporations, food corporations that are putting out this really unhealthy, cheap food, and that's what folks have access to, and that in turn means that they're less healthy and they actually need health care more because of it, but it's health care that they don't have access to because they can't afford it. And here we are having this debate about giving them the help that they need, but not actually coming through with it. If you're sick, if you can't afford to see a doctor, you're going to stay home. Whereas perhaps if you had access to healthcare, you would go in and maybe a quick fix and you're out of there and things are fine. Whereas if you don't have access to the doctor, that sickness will continue to fester and get worse and worse until you have to go visit the emergency room, which is far more expensive than if you had just gone in and seen the doctor in the first place. So it's these systems are interrelated. One thing will impact the other, and we're so, as you're saying, Chad, we're so busy running the rat race, just trying to survive, working 2-3 jobs, that we can't pull our heads out and see, oh, what's going on here? What's the bigger picture? It's more than just us. We're all working hard, but we don't seem to get anywhere. Why is that? And I think that's the question that we really need to be focused on.
I think you bring up a good point in that a lot of the problems that you see at the individual level when it comes to things like not having access to a living wage are just that. A lot of it is a policy problem. And a lot of that is decided upon by policymakers, many of which are elected by very rich people. When Montana Women Vote works to engage with low-income women in the democratic process and their families, so that low-income women have access to voting resources, so that they have access to the polls, so that they know their options in terms of absentee ballots if they are working 2 or 3 jobs and can't make it to the polls on election day. trying to ensure that we have access to same-day voter registration so that folks who, again, are working 2 or 3 jobs and have 2 or 3 kids that haven't had time to register to vote still have access to making decisions that best impact them and that best represent them. So I really do believe that those systems are decided upon or have been historically decided upon by a group of people that are not necessarily representative of the populace in which we're talking about today. So empowering folks, which is what the CLC is really great at doing, empowering the people that are the most impacted by these issues to go out and speak to their leaders, providing avenues for them that actually make sense with their lives and that make sense in terms of what they're actually able to do between working, between family, between kids, and providing them those avenues to have a voice so that when it comes time to determine whether or not we need something like Medicaid expansion in Montana, or when it comes time to make a decision about at what rate we should be increasing the minimum wage, the people that are putting the most pressure upon our policymakers are the people that are most affected by these policies.
That's such a great point. That's really getting to the meat of this is, so we hear a lot about someone who's on food stamps is in line at a grocery store and they pull out their iPhone and people get so upset about that. And that just breaks my heart because it's like, we're pointing the finger at we're so busy pointing the finger at each other. And when we need to be pointing the finger where it belongs. And that would be big business greed and corruption. And we did a report maybe a year ago about the pharmaceutical industry. This is an industry that is raking in just record levels of profits, billions of dollars. And they have, for every member of Congress, there are 2 pharmaceutical lobbyists. They have an army out there making sure that their voices are getting heard. Who's making sure that our voices are getting heard? They have spent, in the past 15 years, they spent almost $3 billion in lobbying Congress. That if you're an elected official, you want job security. You want to be able to continue doing your job. To do that, you need to get votes. To get votes, you need money. And if you're a member of Congress, you have a limited schedule. Are you going to take the meeting with the constituent who's struggling to make ends meet? Or are you going to take the meeting with the lobbyist with a check in their hand? Time and time again, we're seeing that those lobbyists, those corporate interests, are the ones whose voices are coming to the top, who are, being most considered. And so we need to remember where to be pointing our fingers. We're all in the same boat, really. We're all struggling. The whole 99% movement. The reason it's called 99% is because we're all suffering here, and we need to be spending less time pointing fingers at each other and more pointing it in the place that needs to be pointed.
And I think a lot of times when we talk about things like raising the minimum wage, we hear this rhetoric about the small business owner over and over again. But the small businesses, what will the small businesses do? But really, when we look at the larger picture, like you said, take a step back and kind of look at this larger system, the same people who are talking about the small businesses are the same people who don't want things like Medicaid expanded, even though access to healthcare through things like the Affordable Care Act takes pressure off of small businesses. When my coworkers can go online and get healthcare through the Affordable Care Act, they don't have to pressure my employer to provide them healthcare anymore. And that takes pressure off my employer. So we hear this rhetoric around the small business, but it's coming from big business. It's not coming from the small business owners, because the small business owners who make up the really rich, thriving economy we have here in Missoula, they want to do right by their employees. They want to do the right thing. They care about their employees. They understand the struggle that we're all facing, because a lot of the small business owners are facing the same struggle. When you look at some of the small business owners in Missoula, many of them are barely making more than their employees. So this huge disparity between CEO and employee is mostly prevalent in these big businesses, but they have the loudest voice because they have the biggest checkbooks, and so that's the voice that gets heard by the politicians. But it's a manipulative rhetoric to say that small business owners don't support things like increasing the minimum wage.
And it just turns my stomach to see these, really big businesses based somewhere else coming in and putting small business owners out there as their spokespeople, as their proxies, and hiding behind small businesses, and trying to come off as we're just trying to help everyone when they're trying to help their bottom line. That's ultimately where it's at, and that small businesses know that paying their workers well is good business. It's good in the sense that, okay, so if you have a regular schedule, if you're paying good wages, you have less turnover. It's expensive to hire, to fill a vacancy, and also there's the idea that businesses need customers, and when the whole economy, when workers are making better wages, they have more money to spend. You give $1 to a struggling family that is not making ends meet, they're going to spend that dollar yesterday, which helps. They're more likely to take their family out to dinner at a restaurant, so that will help that restaurant. They will see increased demand, which then in turn means they might need to hire some more help to meet this demand. So it's a job creation issue. It's economic stimulus. And whereas if you give that dollar to a corporation or a CEO, what happens to that dollar? They'll put it overseas in some offshore bank account where it does nobody any good. And so this idea that rather than trickle down economics, I don't know about you all, but nothing's trickling down on me. Rather than trickle down, let's see trickle up economics. Let's see bottom up grassroots economics, because that is the one sure way of creating jobs, of getting us to this place of prosperity where we all have fair access to prosper and for opportunity. And I think that's all we're really asking for. Is just, we want to start off, in this race of life, we want to start off at the same starting point. We don't want to be starting off way in the back of the pack. We want to be just have a fair shot. We're not asking for any favors. We just want a fair shot.
I think that's a really great point, and I like that you talked about the fairness of those decisions that happen. I was reading this morning that 78% of the businesses that lobby against things like the increase to minimum wage turned massive profits in the last 4 years. Profits that go, like you said, mostly to CEOs. So it's not like businesses can't afford to provide for their workers in a way that benefits them. I think it's something that we were talking before this started about, which is viewing people like commodities, that some people in a business are worth more than others, that some people's time is worth significantly more than in others. So there's certainly this moral argument towards fairness that should be very compelling to people. Nobody would ever say that you shouldn't be compensated for the hard work that you do. And building a business is no easy job. Running a business is no easy job, certainly. But again, the economic benefits that are seen throughout the community and for businesses when you provide people with a living wage are astronomical. And the ability for many businesses to do so is definitely there. But it's this active decision that we make to not pay someone else enough so that we can make more. And then in turn, we were talking about this earlier too, there's a lot of judgment calls that are made by folks that aren't able to make ends meet. Where, I just feel like we're pointing fingers in the wrong kind of direction, like you said. Why is it that we are questioning an individual working 2 jobs, 60 hours a week that can't make ends meet, but we're not calling into question the same person who has the ability to give that person 1 job for 38 hours a week that provides them with the opportunity to live and live well and provide for their family.
And they have the capacity now to restore the middle class if they make that decision. People living in poverty now will be out of poverty tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the power of the decision they can make. But are they going to make that decision on their own?
We get to decide as a society what decision, what's important to us. And it's this idea, I thought you put it really well. It's this idea that when you're starving, crumbs taste really good. You really want those crumbs. And that's what we're being fed, a steady diet of crumbs right now, when it doesn't have to be that way. And we can collectively decide to not let it be that way. And, and what's immoral about it is when everyone else is dining on crumbs, there are a select few who are dining on cake.
We're seeing across the country right now that people are getting that message and they're tired of crumbs. And you're seeing that, like, whether you have the ability to influence policy directly does not matter. For instance, in Seattle, the workers there were the ones that initiated that $15 minimum wage hike.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't come from policymakers, but their voice was loud enough that they were heard. And they organized. And that should be a message that everyone hears, understands, and implements across the country. We can change this if we organize in those ways.
Yeah, another good example was one that I was just reading this morning. San Francisco just passed a city ordinance that made it so that businesses have to post hours for their workers 14 days in advance. If they change those hours or if they call someone in, and they have to compensate people for that. I mean, when you think about the impact to a low-income woman's schedule that could have, that's astronomical. That's the difference between actually being able to find childcare for your kid or not. It's the difference between being able to make sure that you're home when your kid is, if you want to be or not. Those kind of decisions, again, in San Francisco also, that was the people. It was the people saying, we're fed up with this, we want to change this, and we believe that this is right for us in our community to make these kind of decisions. I think it's also interesting to think about when you talk about minimum wage and the people that it affects, why it is that people talk about minimum wage versus working hours versus working conditions. A lot of it has to do with the populations that are disproportionately affected. I think a lot of folks like to think that minimum wage jobs are primarily held by, younger people that are in high school or college and are just working their way through those two areas, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. But actually 88% of the people that hold minimum wage jobs in this country are adults, and 56% of those are women. And then 60% of those are people of color too. So, I mean, when you talk about a lot of the populations that this disproportionately affects, that's kind of the thing that you're speaking of. Also, this affects kids just as much as it does adults. Of all of those people that are living off the minimum wage, 17 million kids in this country are affected by it. I mean, we've talked about this already, again, but when you're talking about what it is that you put on for dinner, you're not just talking about one individual who's eating top ramen in college. You're talking about a mom earning minimum wage who is making dinner for her kids. A lot of the people that this affects are, it's not the story that's actually being told. The people that are being affected by minimum wage and not having a living wage are different than what a lot of the folks that are decision makers are actually telling us.
Boy, someone's done their research today. It's so true. Another really important piece to this is the idea of debt. We've been talking a lot about earnings and income and earning enough to make ends meet. Our numbers, as shocking as they are, do not even factor in debt loads. Like, if you're not making a living wage and you have debt on top of that, that is just, so it's this value of folks just want to have a fair shot at getting a leg up in society. I think that's to me, that's the American dream, is I want a shot to live whatever my dreams are. I want a shot at being able to prosper economically. And we're putting folks so behind the eight ball that it's not possible. In this study, we actually looked at debt. We compared two groups, like a group of what we define as low income, and we had to pick a point, so we just defined that as $15. So folks who make less than $15 an hour versus folks who make more, and we looked at the debt loads compared to their income, and we see like the higher income group making exponentially more, or they have exponentially more resources to pay off their debt than the low income group. And if you're not making ends meet as it is, how are you expect to actually pay off your debt? Then there's this idea, okay, well, it's up to us to be able to get access to this opportunity, get an education. People who are doing all the right things, keeping their head down, working hard, going to school. And they're coming out of school in Montana, the average debt load for an undergraduate coming out is $27,000 in debt. That has increased, I believe, in the last 5 years or so. That's increased by $10,000. And what message are we sending our graduates? We're gonna defund higher education and pass the costs off onto you, whereas an educated society is a stronger, more integrated society. If we make it so difficult to get that education, what is that going to do to the fabric of our society? It's going to erode it over time, and we're going in that direction right now, and it's quite frankly, it's terrifying. So maybe could you guys talk about how debt impacts your life?
I mean, I certainly can. I have quite a bit of student loan debt. And I mean, it definitely impacts whether or not I will be able to buy a home in the next decade or not. It certainly impacts whether or not I'd be able to make, I mean, I'm assuming that you're talking about, big dollar decision making kind of things, like buying a new car or not, buying a home or not. What I frequently find, though, is in myself and a lot of folks that I know that are single adults that have a lot of student loan debt, it really can mean the difference between someone being able to pay their rent or not. And I think we don't like to think of it that way. We assume that when someone graduates from college, if they are able to find a job, it's going to be something that can not only, pay off their student loan debt, but also be something that can afford them with the basic necessities to live. That's not the case in a lot of people's experiences. So what can happen is, more saddled up debt. Credit cards end up being a huge factor. Most homes in the United States rely upon a form of debt in order to compensate for what they're not making in their jobs. Interesting point, though, that I thought was great in the report was that a lot of low-income earners default less frequently than high-income earners do. So when you talk about having debt, I think it's something that we're pretty ashamed of talking about. I think we view it as a sign of, oh, I didn't earn enough in college, or I didn't get enough scholarships in order to be able to afford school, or, yeah, I have quite a bit of student loan debt. Is that going to affect whether or not my partner and I are able to buy a home? It's just not something that we like to talk about. It's something that we sweep under the rug, even though the vast majority of us have debt. And what that creates is a situation where people don't really know their options and what's available to them. And it also, I don't know, it ends up being the difference between whether or not someone is able to make ends meet and make those big dollar decisions. But we also have this moral attitude of debt being something that means that you're a bad person. If someone has a lot of debt that is determining whether or not they do make their ends meet, then they must have made a really bad financial decision for themselves. And that's not necessarily the case, because when you talk about default rates, it's not low-income people that are defaulting more often than not. It's more high-income people. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and that's a good point to bring up. One of the really surprising to us findings from our study, we looked at this data set that the Fed puts out. And one of the questions they ask is, have you defaulted on your loan in the past 60 days? Have you not been able to make your debt payment? And 9 out of 10 of the low income group actually did not report that. So 9 out of 10, they're prioritizing their debt payments even when they're not able to make ends meet. These are, I mean, this is like, you talk about personal responsibility. To me, we are taking responsibility, maybe a little too much so, personal responsibility. And again, it gets to that notion, where are we pointing those fingers? A lot of the folks out there working hard, doing the right things, keeping your head down, but we're pointing the fingers at ourselves, at each other, and not where it should be. The question is, do we feel like we're represented in Congress, in Helena? I don't know if our representatives have our best interests at heart. They have the interests of those who provide them the resources to run their campaigns.
I think here in Montana we have a lot of really good politicians who come from very humble roots and remember those as they move forward. Amanda Curtis, she's our girl. She's amazing. She's going to fight for us to the end if she gets elected. And John Testers always stands up for the working class. However, the larger system at play makes it hard for those few voices to really come together. The partisanship makes it difficult. But the Montana legislature, I think here in Montana we really value independence and individualism and the bootstraps, really being able to pull yourself up out of poverty. And I think that the vast majority of our legislators have our backs on these things. I think they're maybe just confused or a little misled. I think a lot of times when these decisions are made, they're made through a type of lens that doesn't really reflect reality. The folks that I work with, the folks who work in the service industry with me, are not just waiters and waitresses. They're preschool teachers, they're social workers, they work in nonprofits, they own their own businesses, they have their own yoga studios. These are folks who are really innovative and really entrepreneurial, and they're working 2-3 jobs to make ends meet. But when we think about these low income jobs or these low wage jobs, we're so quick to think about things like food service, hospitality. But when you really look at the economic landscape, especially here in Missoula, we find people who are working professional jobs with real fancy titles at nonprofits making $8 or $9 an hour. We see folks working at places like Opportunity Resources, taking care of other people with a lot of responsibility on their shoulders, who are still not making a living wage. So I think a lot of times when we think about low wage workers, there's this classist lens that comes in, that these are uneducated folks, that these are folks who haven't done enough, made the right decisions, but that's just simply not true. And it becomes internalized. I've heard my coworkers say things like, well, here I am, I'm 30 and I'm still just like working at a pizza place. But they're really good at their job. People walk in the door and they take care of them and they serve them and really put the needs of others before their own for those 6 hours a night that they come and work at the pizza place. And that's remarkable. It's remarkable to be able to put someone else's needs before your own. And I think those are the types of things that people don't think about when they think about low-wage workers. These are people taking care of other people, taking care of you. If there's not somebody to clean the toilet, you have to clean the toilet. So are we going to compensate this person fairly for cleaning this toilet, or are you going to grab your scrub brush and get down there yourself? But people don't think about it that way. And so there's this inherent latent classism that comes into play. And that's what we need to break down culturally. We need to start talking about this. We need to start saying that, I only have so many hours on this planet, and if I'm going to take some of those hours and do it so you can profit, I deserve fair compensation for that. And people just need to really start realizing their own value as an employee, regardless of the nature of the labor that they do.
So what are some of the things that we need our legislators to be pushing for us?
There's a couple different things that I can think of. First, I think it's really important to remember that votes are voices, especially in a state like Montana, where our gubernatorial races are decided by a couple hundred votes. It is super important that people get out and vote, and that they have the opportunity to vote for folks that represent their interests, whatever those may be. A couple things that I think we're going to see be huge players for low-income folks is, first of all, Medicaid expansion. Again, there are 70,000 people in this state that do not have access to health care, that need access to health care, and that can, again, be the difference between someone making it or not making it that month. It also is a huge economic benefactor to our state. It's good, like Emily said, when employers aren't the only ones, paying for someone's health insurance. But health insurance is a human right. Someone should not have to worry about whether or not it's going to ruin their family if they break their back while they're, working that day. Those are decisions that folks just should not have to be faced with. I think another thing that would be really interesting to see people taking into account when they go to the polls is early childhood education and access to that right. I mean, we've talked a lot about higher education in this discussion so far and how important that is for folks, even with the cycle of debt that comes with that. But I mean, when we talk about bootstraps, it's really hard to tell someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they don't have boots to begin with. And part of providing someone the opportunity to, have boots is making sure that they have the same access to education that every other kid has when they're small, that they're provided the same opportunities as any other kid when they're small. So early childhood education is certainly important. Along with that, I think making sure that we fund our higher education system to a point at which Montana students are actually able to go to Montana universities and graduate and find jobs in this state is super important. A lot of things that you talk about when you think about higher education in other places is an issue of brain drain. Brain drain is essentially when someone is educated in the place where they live, but they end up having to move somewhere else in order to be compensated for the education that they've received. When we don't saddle our students with huge amounts of student debt, they can afford to stay in state. And we live in a beautiful, wonderful state. We always talk about how people leave Missoula specifically waiting the rest of their lives to come back, trying to come back for the rest of their lives. People want to be here. So if we're not saddling ourselves with massive amounts of student debt, we retain our smartest people that can make fantastic decisions for our state. And that's a whole process from the start of, preschool and making sure that everyone has access to preschools that are accredited and making sure that everyone has the funding to send their kid to preschool all the way up through higher education.
I'd like to see paid time off. I think that when we're talking about paid time off, we're talking about a public health issue. I know personally there have been days when I probably should not have been around strangers' food, and those are the days that I hide in the back and don't run any food and wash my hands 12 million times. And but I'd rather not be in that situation ever again. I'd like to be in a place where if I'm sick, I can just say, I'm not coming to work because I don't want to get anybody else sick. When you're dealing with food, that's a public health issue. So I think that paid time off is important because if you can't afford to take that day off, you're working 4 nights a week. That's a whole day's income. Nobody can afford to do that.
We need to begin exploring legislation and policy that affects and combats and pushes back against the corrosive effects of corporations in our communities that offer no community benefit with their existence here other than low-wage jobs. You can think of probably an entire list of corporations that exist here that profit constantly. Those profits go out. They don't come back in our community. They go out of state. There's plenty of legislation out there that's being tested in different states that we should introduce here in Montana.
I think the last thing that I would also say is that I'm really excited by the studies that are being done at the federal and state level about paid maternity leave. I think that is super important for low-income folks because your low income doesn't mean that you don't want a family and that you're not going to have a family. But those decisions are drastically affected by whether or not someone is paid, during their maternity leave, and that's super important for families. And it's a right. It's a reproductive right for women. So it's something that I'm really excited to see happening federally.
These are all policies that will help improve the quality of life for all of Montana, and I think that's kind of the common thread I'm hearing here. I want to kind of take a minute to talk about higher education. We just put out a report a couple days ago in conjunction with the Montana Organizing Project called Mountains of Debt, where we actually calculate some of the debt loads that Montana graduates are coming out with. I think with the legislature, first and foremost, we need to stop the bleeding. So in the past 5 or so years, we've seen higher education get defunded by about 7% or so. We need to stop that trend. We're going in the wrong direction. And secondly, and also that defunding is why we see this huge increase in debt loads, because we're passing the cost off onto these students. And secondly, we need to do a better job of giving financial aid to those students who just want an education but can't afford it, because the sticker shock is so high. Montana is a leader in a lot of great ways, but one of the ways Montana's a leader in a bad way is in the way we fund our financial aid. So if you look at how much we spend per student across the country, only 8 states provide less than Montana, $122 per student. And we're ranked in the bottom tier, and we got to do better. We can do better. And it comes down to a question of whether we have the will, and whether our policymakers have the will depends on us, depends on our voices, and making sure that we're in their ear and they know what is important to us. And we have to demand it. If we don't demand it, it's not going to happen. And increasing the minimum wage, that will be a nice step towards getting us to a living wage. So we've got some really great solutions here. We're gonna fix this. We're gonna save the world.
Well, thank you for being here and doing this. We have a few minutes. I don't know if anyone wants to wrap up and say something before we.
I think when we talk about all of these issues, it keeps coming back to that idea of values. And in Montana, we like to tout a lot, especially in our politics, what a Montana value is. We talk about Montana values a lot. And I think when you talk about something like Medicaid expansion, like higher education, and providing a living wage for individuals and families so that they can make ends meet and invest in their own local communities, it is this value of I am my brother and my sister's keeper. It should be and is a Montana value that we value one another more so than we do some large businesses' interests. And we understand in this state and are fighting for people being able to not only invest in a quality life for themselves, but being able to invest in stronger and better communities as a result of it. And when you think about providing someone a living wage, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to making sure that families and individuals have access to that basic human right, which is I have the right to live well and to provide for my family well. And then as we've talked through this whole discussion, that ripples into a vast variety of things. And when it comes to who we vote for, I think that's where we have our opportunity to have a huge impact on who those people are that make decisions for us on behalf of living wages, on behalf of Medicaid expansion, on behalf of higher education.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, again, this idea that when you're starving, the crumb looks really appetizing. Mm-hmm. I think we want to be looking out for each other, but it's hard to do that when you're struggling to look out for yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like a luxury to be able to step back and look around and see, hey, my neighbor needs some help. I'm going to go help them out. I don't blame anyone for that because we're struggling so hard to survive. Mm-hmm. And the challenge that we need to take on is being able, despite being in that position, to step back and see the larger systems at play. Don't be so hard on ourselves, don't blame ourselves for this. If you're doing the right things, and that's the thing that is really disturbing about what we're seeing is, even if you're making all the right moves, you're still not able to get a leg up. And so I think that would be my parting message is, let's, and it's up to us. Let's take a step back and point the fingers where they should be pointed and not at each other.
Yep.
Emily, you want to jump in?